Okay, so as we're coming down to the last little bit of liquid here, folks, I'm going to ask Lee to bring in the camera a little closer. And so we're finishing up evaporation of the dichloromethane from the crude caffeine here. And so I'm going to go ahead and rotate just a little faster. But if you notice, the liquid is boiling, and we do have some white stuff coming up at the top. And you might think it's condensation, but I am rubbing my finger against it to show you that no, it is not. That is actual solid collecting on the inside part of the round bottom flask. And if you notice, we're developing nice thick bands of solid happening on the inside of the flask. Some of the caffeine is white, and some of it has a slight yellowy tint to it. That's because chlorophyll has come along into the organic layer with our crude caffeine. So the slight yellowy green tint is due to chlorophyll. All right, we're going to go ahead and let this finish evaporating to complete dryness inside of the round bottom flask, and we'll weigh our solid and determine the amount of crude caffeine. All right, so students, here is our crude caffeine inside of our round bottom flask, and as you can see, we have no liquid inside of the flask. All we have is a nice solid that is attaching to the inside part of our round bottom flask. Since we pre-measured the weight of the flask, I'm going to go ahead and take this flask over to the scale. We're going to reweigh to see how much caffeine we have isolated. All right, since this is a round bottom flask, I went ahead and placed the cork on top of my scale and teared it out so that I will receive only the mass of the flask and the crude caffeine. All right. And so we have a mass of 88.7952 grams. Let's go on over to the fume hood so we can write down our data. Alrighty, so just a little data that students will want to ensure that they've collected. During this experiment, we used 6 tea bags for our tea solution. We used 5.1 grams of calcium carbonate, 5 grams of sodium chloride, 6 grams of magnesium sulfate, 75 milliliters of dichloromethane. Our round bottom flask mass by itself was 88.6236 grams, and our flask with crude caffeine had a mass of 88.7952 grams. Using those two data points, you will be able to determine the mass of just the crude tea. All right, students, so we have our crude caffeine, and what I've been doing using my micro spatula here is scraping down the edges of the glass so that I can release the solid caffeine. I pre-measured my Petri dish here so that I can, recover as much solid as I possibly can into the Petri dish. So now I'm going to go ahead and just lightly tap my round bottom flask and I'm actually going to choose this is kind of late. So we're going to go ahead and tap this solid into the Petri dish. All right, so a little bit did fly out, but that's okay. We're going to remeasure this amount of solid so that I'll know exactly how much crude caffeine I am subliming. All right, let's go ahead and go over to the scale and find out how much I have. All right, so here's our crude caffeine inside of our Petri dish, which we just scraped out. I went ahead and teared the scale. We're going to place this in here and find out exactly how much crude caffeine we were able to manage into the container. All right, and it looks like we've got a value of 17.824. I'm going to go ahead and round out 824 grams. Oh, it did. All right, wonderful. So using this difference in mass here, folks, you will be able to determine roughly how much crude caffeine we are about to sublime. All right, so we have our Petri dish with our crude caffeine. I'm going to go ahead and spread the caffeine around just a little bit so that it won't be all stacked into one area. And so I'm going to go ahead and spread it around the Petri dish just slightly. I'm going to go ahead and shake it to spread it around a little more. I have 3 Wattman size 1 filters, and I'm going to go ahead and place them on top. Alrighty. And then I'll be back with a beaker of ice that we're going to place on top. And now that I've put my system into place, I'm going to leave it alone. I'm going to go ahead and turn on the heat. And we're gonna go for medium heat, so we wanna be at about a 5 on the hot plate. And so in a few minutes, we will hopefully start to see the vapors of sublimation. All right, students, so if you can see here, we have some sublimation occurring. We see the white smoke of the caffeine occurring in the petri dish. We're going to allow this to continue to sublime for a couple of more minutes, and then we will see how many crystals we have isolated underneath. Okay, students, so if you see here, we have our sublimed caffeine in the petri dish, and you are looking at a very, very zoomed in picture of the bottom half of the petri dish there. If you notice, we have some nice white solid against the inside part of the petri dish. I'm going to go ahead and lift it up gently so that you guys can see what is happening on the bottom of the filter. But we have all of our nice solid caffeine on the filter paper. So I'm going to gently scrape this onto my watch glass. I'm going to go ahead and just scrape directly onto the watch glass. There we go. Now we don't need a ton of caffeine here. We just need enough to be able to make a melt point sample. And so this should be plenty. But I'll ask Lee to bring the camera back into the petri dish area, and I want you guys to see what actual pure caffeine looks like. It's a very fluffy light crystal, and I'm going to go ahead and touch it with my spatula here. But if you notice, it's almost like fur. See? It's almost like a little furry crystal. All right. Let's go ahead and go over to the melt point machine and take our melt point. All right. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and transfer all of our purified sublimed caffeine into our watch glass and measure how much solid we've actually created from our crude caffeine. All right, students, so we're going to go ahead and measure out the mass of our purified caffeine. Let me go ahead and just open this nice and wide so I won't bump off any of our caffeine. And let's take a look and see how much solid we have isolated. Ooh, now this is a good amount. Okay, so the mass on the scale reads 25.66648 grams. And I'll ask Lee to take a quick little close-up of this information here on the side. So we have the mass of the watch glass empty by itself, clean and dry. We have the mass of the watch glass plus the caffeine. Using these two data points, you will be able to determine the mass of the purified caffeine. All right, so we're going to create a melt point sample. I have a capillary tube here and a couple of capillary tubes. And for our melt point tubes, one side is always closed. You'll notice the closed side has a nice rounded bead at the end, and the other side of the capillary tube is just open. And so I'm going to go ahead and take my capillary tube and gently press down onto my solid here. And what should occur after I tap a few times is I get a small amount of solid into the capillary tube. I don't know if you need my hand as a background item, but you should see a small little bit of solid at the end of the tube. All right, I'm going to go ahead and ensure that this gets to the other side. Now there's two different ways we can do this. We can tap to try to move that solid to the bottom, which is usually quite effective, but since I was having trouble tapping it in, we're going to go ahead and use this longer tube, and we're going to drop our capillary tube into the longer tube. And as it bounces up and down, courtesy of the little bead at the end of the capillary tube, notice that we now have all of our nice solid at the bottom of the capillary tube. Now we're going to go ahead and place this into our melt point machine. I'm going to place this into one of the holding cells. Wonderful. And just to ensure for accuracy, I'm going to add 2 more capillary tubes on either side. so that the machine will know we are ready for a melting sample. Okay, now currently the melt point machine is at 228 degrees Celsius, well technically 229. We're going to go ahead and press the enter button and allow it to increase in temperature towards the melt point of caffeine. Well, at the moment you see kind of a solid white block in the center. That's actually the solid caffeine, and eventually it will start to turn liquid. We're just trying our best to focus here, so that you can see it. All right, I do see the solid starting to warp slightly. Ooh, did you see that? It kind of bumped up. I'm gonna go ahead and take a look inside and see if we are moving towards liquid. It should now look like, there we go. The liquid is now breaking on down, and the volume is kind of warping, increasing, decreasing there. There we go. So we are melting, and the temperature is currently 233 degrees Celsius. It looks like we have just a tiny bit of solid left to go. We're hoping to get to 234 Celsius, which is the literature value for the melting point of caffeine. Do you see that last little bit of solid kind of sticking upwards? Looks like a Mickey Mouse ear to the left. There we go. All right, looks like that last little bit has finally fallen. Our current temperature is 234 degrees Celsius. Congratulations, folks. We have melted our sublimed caffeine.